Okay, perfect. Now write script on act keeping in mind. Don't repeat any section, keep it to the point, no beating around bush. Quality I want with same word count mention and don't mention scenes, and don't write headings. Write minimum 1000. Section 1. He was the kind of man who smiled with his eyes. Calm, polite, confident in a way that never needed words. The first time I met him was on my wedding day. My husband introduced him as his closest friend, Arjun. I remember thinking he looked at me for a second too long. Not rudely, not curiously, just long enough to feel something shift in the air. Then he smiled, and the moment dissolved like sugar in tea. Everyone said my husband was lucky. I looked beautiful that day, but what I remember most isn't the garlands or the lights. It's the quiet moment when Arjun said, "He's a good man. Take care of him." Something about the way he said it stayed with me like a whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. The first months of marriage were what people call perfect. New home, laughter echoing through fresh paint, long evenings over coffee and unspoken dreams. But perfection is a strange thing. It makes you blind to cracks until they turn into lines. My husband was good to me, patient, practical, busy. Always busy. Work, dinners, calls that never seemed to end. Eyes that drifted to screens more than to mind at first. I told myself this was normal. Love, after all, settles. It grows quieter, deeper, less demanding. But nights grew longer and silences heavier. I started sleeping facing the other side of the bed. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt easier than trying to find warmth that wasn't reaching back. One evening, months later, Arjun came over. My husband had invited him for dinner. It had been years since they last met, and I could see the easy comfort between them. Laughter, inside jokes, stories of college days. I laughed along, but somewhere in the middle of that laughter, I felt something strange. I caught Arjun looking at me. Not in admiration, not in lust, but in understanding. The kind that feels like being seen after a long time of being invisible. That I looked away. But that gaze lingered longer than it should have. After dinner, when my husband took a call outside, Arjun helped me clear the table. Our hands brushed once, accidental. He froze. So did I. It was a touch so small it shouldn't have meant anything. But in that single second, I felt more alive than I had in months. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the wall. I could hear my husband's steady breathing beside me. Peaceful. Unaware. My mind replayed that small touch over and over, the warmth of his skin against mine, the way my heart raced like I'd done something terrible yet beautiful. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was loyal, faithful, strong. But desire doesn't listen to logic. It's a quiet hunger that sneaks in through loneliness and pretends to be comfort. The next morning, I found myself making tea differently, stronger, the way Arjun liked it. My husband didn't notice. Maybe I didn't want him to. Days passed, then weeks. Whenever Arjun visited, I felt that same pull. Unspoken, restrained, dangerous. We never said anything beyond pleasantries, but our eyes spoke their own language. When he laughed, I felt warmth. When he looked at me too long, I looked away, afraid someone might see what was never meant to be seen. Then came Karva Chauth, my first one as a wife. I had fasted all day. My husband promised he'd come home early, that we'd break the fast together under the moonlight. But hours passed. Messages left on read. Calls unanswered. The moon rose, pale and patient, while I sat by the window, hungry and waiting. Arjun called. He asked if my husband had come home. I said no. He hesitated before saying he was nearby and could drop something off he'd picked up for my husband. I should have said no. I should have waited quietly like a faithful wife. But my voice said yes before my heart had the chance to stop it. When I opened the door, he stood there with that same calm smile, holding a small paper bag. The scent of the night air mixed with something electric, unspoken. He asked softly, "You're fasting, aren't you?" I nodded. He looked at me for a moment, then handed me a bottle of water. You should eat something, he said. That I shook my head. Not until he comes. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. He didn't argue. He just stood there for a while, neither leaving nor stepping in, as if unsure which would be worse. The moonlight fell between us, soft silver, almost forgiving. I don't remember who moved first, but the space between us disappeared. Not in a dramatic, reckless way, but slow, inevitable, like the tide reaching the shore. His hand brushed against mine again, the same electric warmth as before. I closed my eyes, not to escape but to feel. For the first time in a long time I felt seen. Not adored, not worshipped, just seen. That it lasted only a moment. A breath. And then he stepped back, his eyes filled with something that looked like regret. I turned away, ashamed of the pulse I couldn't control. When my husband finally came home, it was past midnight. He was drunk, laughing, apologizing for being late. I smiled, pretending everything was fine. He looked at me with affection, the same affection that used to make my heart flutter. But now it felt distant, rehearsed, like a memory of love instead of love itself. That night, as he slept beside me, I stared out the window at the fading moon. The fast had ended long ago, but I hadn't eaten. Hunger had taken a different shape, something deeper, quieter, impossible to satisfy. Arjun didn't call again for days. I didn't either. But every time I passed that same window, I saw the reflection of that moment, the faint glow of moonlight, the shadow of what should never have been. That I told myself I'd forget. That I'd bury it beneath routine, beneath chores and laughter and time. But the truth is, once you've felt seen by someone who shouldn't have looked, nothing ever looks the same again. I went back to being the perfect wife, the good woman, the quiet homemaker everyone admired. But beneath every word, every smile, there was a silence that spoke louder than anything else, because I knew something now, something that scared me and thrilled me all at once. Desire doesn't always live in grand gestures. Sometimes it hides in moments small enough to fit between two heartbeats. And once you've heard its whisper, you can never. It began with avoidance. The kind that pretends to be distance but is really a disguise for longing. After that night, I avoided every excuse to meet Arjun. I deleted his number, erased our chat, but my mind didn't get the memo. His voice stayed tucked somewhere between my guilt and my heartbeat. My husband noticed. Not what had happened. He wasn't suspicious yet, but the way I had grown quiet, withdrawn, distracted. I blamed it on fatigue, the weather, the weight of new responsibilities. He accepted it with a smile, too comfortable in trust to look deeper. I envied that ease. Days folded into each other. Ordinary on the outside, restless underneath. Every morning, I made tea and stared at my reflection in the steel kettle. Sometimes I barely recognized her, the woman who had done something she could never name. But fate has a way of revisiting what we try to bury. One evening, my husband returned home with news that twisted the air around me. He said Arjun had taken a job in another city and would be leaving soon. He'll come by next week, he said casually, just to say goodbye. That single sentence made my pulse stumble. A week. 7 days to prepare for a goodbye that shouldn't matter. 7 nights to fight the part of me that wanted to see him again. Each day that followed moved slower than the one before. I went through motions, cooking, cleaning, smiling, but my thoughts kept drifting. What would I say to him? How does one say farewell to something that never began? When he finally arrived, it was a Sunday evening. My husband welcomed him like a brother, full of jokes and laughter. I watched quietly from across the room, pretending indifference, but every sound of his voice struck something buried deep. We barely exchanged words, but the silence between them said more than any conversation could. There was distance, restraint, and yet, an unspoken understanding that the memory of that night would never leave either of us. After dinner, my husband received a work call and excused himself to the other room. The moment the door closed, the house fell into a silence that felt heavy and alive. I could feel Arjun's presence beside me, even before he spoke. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. That I nodded. My throat felt dry. "I know." He hesitated, then added softly, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I wanted to believe him. Maybe I even did. But part of me knew meaning has nothing to do with moments that rewrite who you are. I don't blame you, I said finally. He looked at me, eyes filled with something between apology and longing. Then who do you blame? I didn't answer. 'Cause I didn't know. Myself? My loneliness? The silence in my marriage that had become too familiar to question. We stood there. Two people bound by a moment they couldn't name, standing in a space that felt sacred and wrong at the same time. Before he left, he reached for his bag. His hand brushed mine just like before. This time neither of us moved away. The air between us trembled. I could hear my heart pounding louder than the ticking clock in the hallway. For a second I thought he might kiss me. Maybe I wanted him to. Maybe I wanted to stop him. But instead he whispered, "Take care of yourself," and walked out. The door closed softly behind him, but the echo of it felt final. That night my husband found me sitting on the couch staring at nothing. He asked if I was okay. I nodded, forcing a smile. He said, "You'll miss him, won't you?" His tone was light, innocent, teasing. I smiled again, but it felt like a lie pressed against my teeth. "Of course," I said. "He's your best friend." The next few days were quieter than usual. The house felt larger, emptier, almost hollow. Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, expecting a message that never came. Other times I'd convince myself I didn't care. But at night, when everything else slept, my thoughts didn't. They wandered to his words, his eyes, that look of understanding I'd never felt from anyone else. I tried to pray it away. I tried to drown it in guilt. But the heart doesn't forget warmth once it's tasted it. Weeks passed. My husband grew busier, traveling more often, trusting me completely. That trust should have comforted me. Instead, it made the guilt sharper, heavier. Sometimes I'd look at him and wonder what he'd do if he knew. If he'd hate me, leave me, forgive me. But what haunted me most wasn't fear of exposure. It was the quiet truth that I didn't regret it. Not entirely. One night, while scrolling through old photos on my husband's laptop, I came across one of the three of us, smiling at a festival, carefree. I stared at that frozen image for minutes. We looked happy, innocent, untouched by what would come later. I closed the screen, unable to breathe. He struck me then. Infidelity isn't just an act. It's a fracture that begins long before anything happens. It starts in glances that linger, in loneliness that grows roots, in words unsaid. And when it finally happens, it's not about betrayal alone. It's about discovery, the unsettling realization that someone else can awaken parts of you you'd forgotten existed. I began to write again, small thoughts, fragments of emotions I couldn't speak aloud. My husband found one of my notes one morning. It said, "Sometimes the wrong person reminds you how to feel." He laughed, thinking it was a line from a movie. I smiled, pretending it was. That night I stood on the balcony, watching the same moon that had once witnessed everything. I wondered if he was looking at it too, in some distant city, remembering me the way I remembered him. Not with desire anymore, but with a strange kind of sadness that I realized then that love doesn't always heal. Sometimes it leaves you suspended between guilt and yearning, right and wrong, truth and silence. My husband called my name from inside. I turned, smiled, walked back in, carrying my secret like a shadow that would never leave me. And somewhere, deep inside, I understood. What happened that night wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a truth I'd spend my life pretending didn't exist. The days after he left were the hardest. Silence filled the rooms like smoke, heavy and suffocating. I went through motions, cooking, cleaning, folding laundry, but every sound echoed with absence. My husband noticed nothing. He assumed I was tired, stressed, perhaps overwhelmed. I nodded, smiled, convinced him, and convinced myself. But the truth was buried somewhere deeper, in the way my pulse quickened when the door clicked, in the way I reached for a phone that no longer held his number, that I replayed that night endlessly, not in guilt alone but in memory. The way his hand brushed mine, the way he had seen me, truly seen me, in a way no one else had. It wasn't physical. Not entirely. It was something quieter, sharper. A pulse of recognition that made the familiar feel suddenly foreign. My husband called me one evening, asking me to help prepare for a dinner with Arjun. My heart sank. I hadn't thought about seeing him again. I told myself I wouldn't. I told myself I could hide it. but my hands trembled the moment I heard he would arrive. When he came, I watched from a distance as they greeted each other, brothers by every outward measure. Laughter, stories, shared memories, a warmth that should have belonged solely to my husband, filling the space between us. I forced myself to smile, pretend to enjoy the stories, but my mind couldn't stay on the conversation. I could feel him watching me, not with intent, not with desire, but with that same unsettling understanding that it was dangerous, the way our connection existed in silence, in brief glances, in a shared acknowledgement that nothing could ever be named. I felt exposed and alive at the same time. Later, my husband excused himself to take a call. The house grew quieter, smaller, almost suffocating. He moved closer to me, and suddenly all pretense fell away. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Our proximity said everything. His hand brushed my arm, a repetition of what had already happened, and this time I did not flinch that I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to say the words that haunted me. But words are fragile, and our silence was heavier, fuller, unbearable. I shouldn't have stayed that night, he said quietly. I know, I whispered. Not a defense. Not a confession. Just a breath that carried everything I couldn't say. He hesitated, eyes dark, searching mine. Then who do you blame? I wanted to answer. I wanted to scream that it was loneliness, that it was the emptiness of a marriage I didn't understand, that it was him, the way he made me feel alive again, in a moment I wasn't supposed to be alive. But I didn't. I only shook my head. The next hours were torture. My husband laughed in the next room, oblivious to the storm contained in 2 heartbeats of floor above. Arjun stood there, silent, waiting for a cue to leave, but neither of us moved. There was no relief in his presence, only a reminder of the line we had crossed without knowing it. When he finally took his leave, his hand brushed mine once more, lingering. I closed my eyes, felt a shiver I would never admit. Take care of yourself, he whispered, and left. The door clicked behind him. I remained standing, feeling a hollow ache settle in my chest. That sound was not the end. It was a beginning of awareness, of guilt, of a knowledge I could not escape. The nights that followed, my mind replayed every detail. Every glance, every touch, every shared silence. My husband remained unaware, his trust unbroken, his love constant. But for me, trust had become fragile, and love had acquired a dangerous edge. I began to see him everywhere. In reflections, in passing strangers, in memories too vivid to ignore. Sometimes I would catch myself typing his name, then deleting it again and again. My phone became a monument to what could not exist. Weeks later, my husband returned home from a trip. He spoke about Arjun casually, unaware that the mention of him caused a tremor beneath my calm exterior. I smiled, nodded, answered politely, but every word carried a weight I could not measure. Late one night I found a message on my phone. Arjun had sent it before leaving. I hope you're okay. I hope you forgive me someday. I stared at it for long minutes. The message was both a lifeline and a condemnation. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Some things I realized are not meant for words. Some truths exist only in the quiet between 2 people, forever unspoken. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the presence of both men in my mind. The one I had chosen, the one I hadn't. The one I loved in duty, the one who had awakened something long dormant. It was an infidelity in the conventional sense. There was no act beyond a touch, no betrayal beyond the recognition of desire. But the consequences were already real. My heart had divided silently, painfully between loyalty and longing. And so I learned that guilt is a constant companion, that it can linger like a shadow, darker at night, inescapable in the silence of a room. That desire cannot always be tamed, no matter how much you want to control it. The days continued. Life moved forward. My husband remained the anchor, unwavering, secure in his trust. And yet within me a storm churned. I began to understand something I could never undo. Moments shape us, even when fleeting. They live in the spaces we pretend are empty. In the corners of our mind we never show anyone. I began to write again. Words bleeding onto paper like confessions. Words I would never send. Words that carried the weight of both men, of longing and restraint, of knowing and guilt. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand at the window and watch the moon, remembering him, remembering us. I didn't crave him anymore, not in the physical sense, but in the way you crave clarity, truth, or recognition. I craved the knowledge that I had felt alive, even if only for a moment I could never reclaim. Love and desire are fragile. So are choices. I understood finally that the consequences of a single touch, a single gaze, could linger long after the actors had left the stage. And I would carry that knowledge quietly, forever.